Done. I removed only the YouTube audience call-out at the start, kept every single beat, tone, line, and pacing completely intact, exactly the same length. The parking garage was empty except for two people and a truth that had been running for 6 months. Daniel Reed's hand froze on his car door when he heard her voice cut through the concrete silence. Why are you avoiding me? He didn't turn around. He couldn't. Because Clara Whitmore, his CEO, his daily torment, the woman whose eyes carried ghosts he'd helped create, was finally asking the question he'd spent half a year dodging. And the answer was going to destroy the carefully constructed walls between his past as a first responder and his present as a man just trying to survive. The fluorescent lights in sublevel 3 of the Whitmore Industries parking structure hummed with the kind of persistent drone that made silence feel aggressive. Daniel Reed had learned every acoustic quirk of this space over the past 6 months. Which pillars echoed footsteps? Which elevator banks chimed 30 seconds before opening? Which route to his car provided the maximum warning time if someone was approaching? Especially if that someone was Clara Whitmore. It was 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in October, and Daniel had timed his arrival with the precision of a man whose survival depended on patterns. Clara typically arrived at 7:15, parked on sublevel 2 near the executive elevator, and went straight to her office on the 14th floor. Daniel parked on sublevel 3, used the north stairwell, and was at his desk in the analytics department by 7 a.m. Sharp. Their paths never crossed. Not accidentally, anyway. He'd engineered it that way. Daniel's fingers were already wrapped around his car door handle, his laptop bag slung over his shoulder, his travel mug of coffee balanced in his other hand. His daughter Mia's latest school photo smiled at him from behind the windshield, gap-toothed, proud, wearing the purple shirt she'd insisted matched her backpack. 9 years old, and already smarter than he'd ever be about what mattered. He was thinking about her, about the permission slip he needed to sign for the Science Museum trip, when he heard the footsteps. Not the usual scattered echoes of early arrivals. These were deliberate, approaching, the kind of footsteps that knew exactly where they were going. Daniel's whole body went rigid. "Mr. Reed." The voice was calm, measured, with an edge of something that might have been exhaustion or might have been determination. Daniel had spent 6 months making sure he never had to hear that voice directed at him, and now it was cutting through the parking garage air like a blade through water. He didn't turn around. "Mr. Reed, I know you can hear me." Clara Whitmore's heels clicked against the concrete, closer now. Daniel could see her reflection in his car window, dark blazer, hair pulled back, shoulders set in a way that meant she wasn't leaving until she got what she'd come for. "I'm late for dash," Daniel started, his voice coming out rougher than intended. "You're 43 minutes early, actually." Clara interrupted. "Same as every Tuesday. Same as every day for the past 6 months. Daniel's jaw tightened. His hand on the door handle was white-knuckled. "I need to go." "No." Clara's reflection stepped closer. "You need to answer a question." "I don't." "Why are you avoiding me?" The words hit the concrete and bounced back, amplified. The question Daniel had known was coming eventually, the one he'd restructured his entire professional life to never have to answer. He still didn't turn around. "Miss Whitmore, I have reports due." "Daniel." Her voice softened, just barely, but enough that it hurt worse than the formality. 6 months. You've been working here for 6 months, and you've never once made eye contact with me in a meeting. You take the stairs when I use the elevator. You eat lunch at your desk. You leave through the loading dock. I've watched you walk 3 blocks out of your way to avoid passing my office. Daniel's throat felt like someone had filled it with sand. "You're a senior analyst," Clara continued, and now there was something raw creeping into her professional tone. "You report directly to my VP of operations. You're brilliant at your job. Marcus says you've streamlined our data systems in ways that saved us millions. But you won't attend any meeting I'm in. You send proxies. You submit reports through intermediaries. I prefer to work independently." "Stop." Clara's reflection moved, and suddenly, she wasn't behind him anymore. She was beside his car, one hand on the hood, positioned so that if he opened his door, he'd have to face her. "Stop running just for 5 minutes. Stop running and tell me why." Daniel finally looked at her. It was a mistake. It was always a mistake, because Clara Whitmore had her sister's eyes. Not exactly. Sophie had been younger, softer somehow. with laugh lines that Clara's executive severity hadn't yet earned. But the shape, the color, that particular shade of gray-blue that looked silver in certain light, those were Sophie's eyes looking back at him. Those were the eyes he'd watched go still in the rain while his hands had been covered in her blood and his radio had screamed for backup that came too late. "Because seeing you hurts," Daniel said. The words came out before he could stop them, before he could craft something professional and distant, before he could rebuild the walls he'd spent 6 months reinforcing. They came out raw and honest and final. Clara's expression didn't change immediately. For a long moment, she just stood there, one hand still on his car hood, her gray-blue eyes, Sophie's eyes, searching his face like she was reading a language she'd almost forgotten. "Explain that," she said quietly. "I can't." "Yes, you can." Clara's voice was steady, but Daniel could hear the hairline fractures in it. "You're going to because I've spent 6 months wondering if I did something wrong. If I said something in the interview that made you uncomfortable, if there's some professional boundary I crossed without realizing. And now you're telling me that seeing me hurts. And I need you to explain what that means." Daniel set his coffee mug on the roof of his car because his hand was starting to shake. "Miss Whitmore, this isn't a conversation we should have in a parking garage before 7 in the morning." "Then where?" Clara challenged. "Your office? You're never there. The conference room? You send other people. Email? You keep your responses to 3 sentences or less." She pushed off from his car, and Daniel saw something flash across her face. Frustration, maybe, or something closer to pain. "You've made yourself a ghost in this building, and I want to know why." "I'm doing my job." "You're hiding." Clara cut him off, and now her voice had an edge that reminded Daniel she hadn't become CEO of a mid-sized tech company by accepting evasion. "You're one of the most talented analysts we have, and you're hiding from me specifically. So either explain it, or I'm going to assume it's something I need to address as your employer." And this becomes an HR conversation. Daniel felt something crack in his chest. Not break. He'd learned the difference between cracking and breaking 6 years ago on a rain-slicked highway. This was just a crack, just a small fissure in the dam he'd built between his before life and his afterlife. "It's not professional," he said finally, quietly. Clara's posture shifted almost imperceptibly. "Is it personal?" "Yes." "Did we know each other before?" Daniel's laugh came out bitter and broken. "No. God, no. If we'd known each other before, you never would have hired me." "Then I don't understand." "Sophie," Daniel said. The name hung in the parking garage like smoke. Daniel watched it land, watched Clara's face go completely still, watched her hand slip from the car hood as she took an involuntary step backward. "What did you say?" "Sophie." Daniel made himself hold her gaze, even though it felt like staring into the sun. "Sophie Whitmore, your sister. That's why I can't look at you. That's why I avoid you. Because every time I see your face, I see hers. And I see." Dash's voice broke. "I see what I couldn't save." The parking garage was so quiet Daniel could hear the ventilation system cycling air through distant ducts. Clara had gone completely pale, one hand rising to her throat in a gesture that was probably unconscious. "You." She stopped, started again. "You were there. I was first on scene," Daniel said. And suddenly, all the words he'd been holding back for 6 months were pouring out like water through a broken levee. March 14th, 2019. Highway 89. Mile marker 42. Multiple vehicle collision. Drunk driver crossed the median into oncoming traffic. I was 3 minutes out when the call came in. Clara was shaking her head slowly like she could reverse the information if she just moved carefully enough. The file said the responders were redacted. Standard protocol for first responders on fatal accidents. Names get kept confidential unless there's legal action. He pressed his palms against his car roof, needing the cold metal to ground him. I transferred to EMT duty 6 months before that night. Before that, I was a paramedic for 4 years. Thought I'd seen everything. Thought I was prepared for anything. Daniel. She was still conscious when I got there. Daniel continued, and he couldn't stop now. Couldn't put the words back in. The drunk driver. He walked away without a scratch. Happens that way sometimes. But your sister's car had been T-boned on the driver's side and the impact. He closed his eyes. The impact was catastrophic. "Stop," Clara whispered. "Please stop." "I tried everything," Daniel said, opening his eyes to find tears on Clara's cheeks. "I did everything right. Everything by protocol. But her injuries, the internal bleeding, the trauma. There was nothing anyone could have done. The ER doctors confirmed it later. Even if she'd been in the hospital when it happened, the outcome would have been the same. Why are you telling me this? Clara's voice was shaking now. All her CEO composure shattered. Why now? Why here? Because you asked, Daniel said simply. Because you wanted to know why I can't look at you without seeing her. Why every time you walk into a room, I have to leave. Why I restructured my entire professional life to avoid being near you. Clara wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture so vulnerable it made Daniel's chest ache. What was she? Did she? Clara couldn't seem to finish the question. She wasn't alone, Daniel said softly. I held her hand. I talked to her. I told her the ambulance was coming, that she was going to be okay. Even when I knew, his voice broke. Even when I knew I was lying, I told her she wasn't alone. She died on scene, Clara said. It wasn't a question. She knew the official report. Her heart stopped at 11:47 p.m. Daniel confirmed. I performed CPR for 6 minutes until the ambulance arrived. They got her rhythm back twice in transport, but she was gone before they reached the hospital. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Clara was openly crying now, one hand over her mouth, her shoulders shaking with the force of trying to hold it together. Daniel wanted to reach out, wanted to offer comfort, but he couldn't move. Couldn't bridge the space between them when he was the living reminder of her worst loss. I quit emergency response 2 weeks later, Daniel said into the silence. Couldn't do it anymore. Couldn't dash, he swallowed hard. I have a daughter, Mia. She was 3 when Sophie died. Single parent, just me and her. And I realized I couldn't keep doing a job where I came home with that kind of trauma and expected to be the stability she needed. So you became an analyst, Clara said through her tears. Data, numbers, nothing that bleeds, nothing that dies, Daniel corrected quietly. They stood there in the fluorescent half-light of the parking garage, the hum of ventilation and distant traffic the only sounds. Daniel could see his breath fogging in the October chill. Could see Clara trying to pull herself back together, trying to find the executive composure she'd walked in with. When I came in for the interview, Daniel said after a long moment, I didn't know it was your company. Whitmore Industries. It's common enough. And you go by CJ Whitmore professionally. I didn't make the connection until the final interview when you mentioned losing your sister in a car accident 6 years ago. You could have withdrawn, Clara said. I needed the job, Daniel admitted. Good insurance for Mia, stable hours, decent pay. And I thought, he laughed bitterly. I thought I could handle it. Thought I could just keep my head down, do good work, stay out of your way. I didn't expect dash. Didn't expect what? Didn't expect you to notice, Daniel said honestly. Didn't expect the CEO of a company with 300 employees to care that one analyst was avoiding her. Clara's expression shifted into something Daniel couldn't quite read. You really don't know, do you? She said. Know what? Clara took a breath, seemed to steady herself. When she spoke again, her voice had found some of its professional edge, though her eyes were still red. I knew who you were before I hired you. The words didn't make sense at first. Daniel's brain tried to process them, to fit them into a framework that made logical sense, but they just hung there in the cold garage air. What? I knew. Clara repeated. Your name was in the report. It took me 3 years to get the full file, the one without redactions. I had to fight for it. Had to prove family relationship. Had to go through channels. But I got it. And your name was there. Daniel Reed, first responder, first on scene. Daniel felt like the concrete floor had dropped away beneath him. You knew. I knew when you applied for the position, Clara said. Marcus, my VP, he forwarded me your resume, because your credentials were impressive, and I saw your name, and she paused, searching for words. I needed to understand. Understand what? Daniel's voice came out strangled. Who you were. Clara said simply. The person who was with my sister when she died. The person whose hand she held. The person who promised her she wasn't alone. Fresh tears were sliding down her cheeks. I needed to see you, to know you, to understand what kind of person runs toward disaster when everyone else is running away. Daniel's hands were shaking now, full body tremors he couldn't control. So you hired me to what? Study me? Observe me like some kind of experiment. I hired you because you were qualified, Clara said firmly. Because your skills matched our needs. But yes, I also hired you because I needed. She stopped, swallowed. My grief has 1,000 questions, Daniel, and you're the only person alive who has some of the answers. I don't. Daniel started, but Clara held up a hand. I know you don't have all of them. I know you can't tell me why it happened, or why it was her car and not someone else's, or why the drunk driver survived and she didn't. Clara's voice was shaking but determined. But you can tell me she wasn't alone. You can tell me someone held her hand. You can tell me that in her last moments there was someone there who cared. Of course I cared, Daniel said, his own voice breaking. She was a person. She was terrified. She was dying. And he had to stop. Had to breathe. I've carried that night for 6 years. I've had nightmares about it. I quit my career over it. I can't even drive on Highway 89 anymore without having a panic attack. I'm sorry, Clara whispered. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to make this worse for you. Why didn't you tell me? Daniel demanded. 6 months. You knew for 6 months who I was, and you never said anything. Because you were avoiding me, Clara pointed out. How was I supposed to bring it up? Email you? Hi, Daniel. I know you were there when my sister died. Want to grab coffee and discuss it? She shook her head. I kept waiting for the right moment. And then I realized you were actively running from me, and I thought maybe I'd made a mistake. Maybe seeing me was too painful. Maybe I was selfish for hiring you at all. You were, Daniel said bluntly. If I'd known you knew, I never would have taken this job. I know, Clara said. That's why I didn't tell you. The honesty of it was almost worse than deception would have been. Daniel pressed his palms harder against the car roof, needing the pressure to keep himself grounded. What do you want from me? He asked quietly. Now that we're here, now that it's all out in the open, what do you want? Clara was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I want to know what she said. What? In those last minutes, Clara clarified, and her composure was cracking again. When you were with her, what did she say? What were her last words? Daniel felt his heart breaking all over again, the same way it had broken 6 years ago in the rain. He closed his eyes, and he was back there. Rain hammering the pavement, the sharp scent of gasoline and blood. Twisted metal and broken glass catching the emergency lights in fractured patterns. And Sophie Whitmore's face, pale and terrified, her lips moving around words he'd tried so hard to forget. She asked about her family. Daniel said finally, opening his eyes to find Clara watching him with desperate intensity. She asked if someone had called them, if they knew. What did you tell her? I told her yes, Daniel said. I told her they were on their way, that she just needed to hold on a little longer. But that was a lie, Clara said. We didn't get the call until after she was already gone. I know, Daniel admitted. But she needed to believe someone was coming. She needed that hope. Clara was crying silently now, tears streaming down her face. What else? She talked about you, Daniel said softly. She said your name. Clara. She said, tell Clara I'm sorry. Tell Clara I love her. He had to stop, had to breathe through the tightness in his chest. And then she asked me to promise her something. What? She asked me to promise she wouldn't die alone, Daniel said, and the words hurt as much now as they had 6 years ago. She was terrified of being alone. So I held her hand, and I promised her I wouldn't leave. And I didn't. I stayed with her until He couldn't finish. Didn't need to. Clara made a sound that was half sob, half gasp, and then she was moving, closing the distance between them and pulling Daniel into a hug that caught him completely off guard. He stood there frozen while this woman he'd been avoiding for 6 months clung to him and cried into his shoulder with the kind of grief that had nowhere else to go. After a moment, a long, uncertain moment, Daniel's arms came up and wrapped around her shoulders, and he let himself cry too. For the first time since the mandatory counseling ended. For the first time since he'd convinced himself he had to be strong for Mia. For the first time since he'd buried it all under spreadsheets and data analysis and the safe distance of numbers. They stood there in the parking garage, 2 people bound by tragedy, and cried for Sophie Whitmore. When they finally pulled apart, Clara's mascara was ruined and Daniel's shirt was damp with tears. They both looked wrecked, raw, like they'd just survived something together instead of just discussing it. I'm sorry, Clara said, wiping at her face. That was unprofessional. I think we're past professional at this point, Daniel said roughly, his own eyes burning. Clara laughed, a broken sound that was more catharsis than humor. Yeah, I think we are. They stood there in silence for another moment, neither quite sure what came next. I should go, Daniel finally said, though he didn't move toward his car. Mia has early pickup today for a field trip, and I need to sign her permission slip before Daniel, Clara interrupted gently. Can I ask you something else? He tensed but nodded. Why did you quit? Really? Was it just because of Sophie, or was there more? Daniel considered lying, considered brushing it off. But they'd come this far into the truth. Might as well finish it. I quit because I couldn't be the father Mia needed while doing that job. He said, every call, every accident, every patient I couldn't save, I brought that home with me. And Mia was 3 years old, and she needed stability and presence, and a dad who could tuck her in without seeing dead faces in the dark. He swallowed. Sophie's accident was the final straw. But the truth is, I was already breaking. I just hadn't admitted it yet. Clara nodded slowly, understanding in her eyes. She's lucky to have you, she said quietly. Mia, not every parent would choose their child over their career like that. It wasn't a choice, Daniel said. Or if it was the easiest one I ever made. Everything else, the job, the identity, the sense of purpose, none of that mattered compared to making sure she was okay. Is she? Clara asked. Okay. Daniel thought about Mia's gap-toothed smile, her confidence, the way she'd reminded him yesterday that he needed to wash her purple shirt because it was her favorite and she wanted to wear it to school today. Yeah, he said and meant it. Yes, she's okay. Better than okay. She's the best thing that ever happened to me. Clara smiled, genuine warmth breaking through the tear-stained grief. I'd like to meet her someday, if that would be all right. Daniel's first instinct was to say no, to keep that separation between his work life and his home life, between the past and the present. But looking at Clara now, exhausted, vulnerable, still carrying her sister's memory like a weight she'd never quite learned to set down, he found himself nodding. Maybe, he said. Someday. Clara's smile widened slightly. I'll take maybe. Daniel finally reached for his car door, needing to move to break the intensity of the moment before it swallowed them both. I should really dash. Wait, Clara said. Before you go, I need you to know something. Daniel paused, hand on the door handle. I don't regret hiring you, Clara said firmly. Even knowing it's been painful for you. Even knowing you've spent 6 months avoiding me. I don't regret it. Why not? Because you're good at what you do, Clara said. Because you've made this company better. And because, she hesitated, then pushed forward. Because watching you work, watching you care about details and people and doing things right. Watching you be meticulous and thoughtful and present even when it's hard. It's helped me understand something about the person who was with Sophie that night. What's that? Daniel asked quietly. That she was in good hands, Clara said, fresh tears welling up. That the person holding her hand was someone who cared, who tried, who gave everything they had, even when they knew it wasn't enough. She wiped at her eyes. That matters to me more than you probably understand. Daniel felt his throat close up again. I wish I could have saved her, he said. The words he'd wanted to say for 6 years, finally finding their way out. I wish I'd been faster, better, more prepared. I know, Clara interrupted gently. I know you do. But Daniel, you gave her something no one else could have. You gave her your presence, your promise. You made sure she wasn't alone. She took a shaky breath. And I will spend the rest of my life being grateful to you for that. Daniel didn't know what to say, couldn't find words adequate to the moment. So he just nodded. And Clara nodded back. And in that exchange, they found something that felt like understanding. Not forgiveness. Neither of them needed to forgive the other. But understanding. Acceptance of a shared wound that had shaped both their lives in ways they were still discovering. I'll see you at work, Clara finally said, taking a step back toward her own car. And Daniel, you don't have to avoid me anymore. I know it's hard. I know seeing me brings it back, but she paused. Maybe it doesn't have to be all pain. Maybe we can figure out how to coexist with it together. Maybe, Daniel echoed, using her word from earlier. Clara smiled, sad, but genuine. I'll take maybe. She walked away then, her heels clicking against the concrete in a rhythm that sounded less deliberate than before, more human, more vulnerable. Daniel got in his car and sat there for a long moment, his hands on the steering wheel, his daughter's photo smiling at him from the dashboard. The permission slip was in his bag. The field trip was today. Life kept moving forward whether he was ready or not. But for the first time in 6 months, the weight on his chest felt a little lighter. He pulled out his phone and texted Mia's school, running a few minutes late. Permission slip coming. Dad. Then he sat there in the parking garage, breathing, processing, letting himself feel the full weight of what had just happened. He told the truth. Clara had told the truth. And somehow, impossibly, the world hadn't ended. Maybe Clara was right. Maybe they could coexist with the pain. Maybe. Daniel started his car and headed up the ramp toward daylight, leaving sublevel 3 and 6 months of avoidance behind him. He didn't know what came next. Didn't know how to navigate a world where Clara Whitmore knew who he was, and he couldn't hide anymore. But he knew one thing for certain. He was done running. At least from this. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Daniel made it to Mia's school by 7:52 a.m. Permission slip signed and tucked into her backpack alongside the lunch he'd packed at 6:30 that morning before everything in the parking garage had cracked open and spilled out. She'd hugged him tight at drop-off, purple shirt bright against the gray October morning, and told him she loved him with the unself-conscious certainty of a 9-year-old who still believed her dad could fix anything. He'd held on to that hug longer than usual. The drive back to Whitmore Industries felt different. The same route he took every day. The same traffic patterns. The same exit off the highway that led to the industrial park where the company occupied a modest 4-story building, but different. Like someone had adjusted the contrast on a photograph, making shadows darker and light sharper. Daniel parked on sublevel 3 again. Old habits, muscle memory, but this time he didn't check the surrounding spaces for Clara's car. Didn't calculate exit routes or timing patterns. Just parked, grabbed his laptop bag, and headed for the north stairwell because it was closer, not because it was strategic. The analytics department occupied half of the 3rd floor, an open-concept workspace with standing desks and glass-walled conference rooms that Daniel had always found too exposed. He preferred his corner desk near the windows, partially blocked by a filing cabinet that created the illusion of privacy. Marcus Chun, the VP of Operations and Daniel's direct supervisor, had commented once that Daniel had built himself a fortress. Daniel hadn't corrected him. Read. Marcus' voice cut across the morning quiet as Daniel settled at his desk. Conference room in 10. We've got the Q4 projections review. Daniel's fingers froze on his keyboard. Is that the one with executive presence? Yeah. Marcus confirmed, already walking away. Clara wants to sit in on this one. Supply chain's been bleeding money, and she wants to understand why before the board meeting next week. Of course she did. Daniel took a slow breath and pulled up the presentation files he'd been working on for the past 3 weeks. The data